Good morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation this morning featuring Stefan Aust and Adrian Geiges, who will talk to us about the experiences they've had in and covering China and the compilation of those experiences in their book, Xi Jinping, the Most Powerful Man in the World. We're very pleased to have these two authors with us today to share their reflections on President Xi and on the nature of Chinese developments as they see them. As many of you know, we have been studying American technological competition with China for several years as part of our Great Powers Competition program. Dan Mahaffee, who runs our geotechnology competition program at CSPC and also has some Chinese study and time living in China under his belt, will be moderating the discussion today. But the timing is very interesting as the Chinese Party Congress is going to meet to ratify a historic third term for President Xi, as our President Biden has just released yesterday America's national security strategy, which lists essentially as its #1 component competition with China as a guiding force in our national security thinking. So the timing is very interesting. We are also extremely pleased to have two German authors with a unique perspective, European perspective, international global perspective that can add to our thinking. It's important if we're going to compete with China to understand the thinking of the competitors on the other side of the Pacific. And there's no better way to do that than to interview experts who have lived and studied the issue. So we're pleased to have you both. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over now to Dan Mahaffee to open up the conversation with our two authors. We're looking forward to many good insights today. So thank you both. Dan.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Adrian and Stefan, for joining us. We're thrilled to have this conversation about this book here. I have a copy, so we have a prop for the audience. When it's available, go get it. I do highly recommend it. And I will start, by opening it to you, both to describe your experience and background, your interest in China, what you see from a European perspective that is different, and then why you go so far as to say, which quite a few people would not disagree with you, that Xi Jinping is the most powerful man in the world.
Don't tell it, Joe Biden. Well, actually, to put it in a few words, I was always interested in China because my uncle lived there between 1920 and 1945. So you can imagine when he came back after the war, we were discussing about China all the time, and mostly at a time when a lot of friends of mine went to demonstrations with a red Mao Bible in their hand. So we were discussing about that all the time. And when I became editor of Der Spiegel, the German news magazine, we had 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 correspondents in China when it was possible. And whenever they had a chance for an interview with a politician or whatsoever, I said, I'm going to join you. And then that's why I flew to China quite often and always had part of this interview for once. The first was with the mayor of Shanghai, and one was with Jiang Zemin, and with the last governor of Hong Kong. I went there when Hong Kong was turned over to the Chinese. So I always was there, but I'm not, to say it clearly, I'm not a real China expert. The real China expert is Adrian. We have been working together for the last 30 years. He knows almost every language in the world and has been everywhere. And he has a personal communist background, which is really interesting in the 60s. So maybe he should tell a few words how he got involved with China and with the communist system.
Yeah, Adrian, please.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I was like many in my generation had been very far left-wing in my youth. So I know this whole system which exists in China until now, the leadership of a Leninist party. I know from my own experience, because I'm myself West German, but I studied for 1 year at the Carter School in East Germany. Of course, later I departed from communism, but I know this very well, and that was the reason why I became very interested first in Soviet Union and Russia, where I also was the correspondent in the decisive years. Arrived there in 1990. I mean, I had been there before, but lived in Moscow starting January of 1990, so still the Gorbachev time, and then 2 military coups, the fall down of the Soviet Union, and so on. But of course also was very interested in China, especially with the very big changes going on there. Had been in China first time in 1986, where interestingly met with Li Keqiang, who is the prime minister of China now, and who was the head of the international department of the Communist Youth League then, and who interestingly has, I mean, he's of course not speaking up against Xi Jinping, but he gives some other nuances when he talks about the COVID lockdown and so on. Anyway, so I was interested. I lived for 1 year actually also in Hong Kong in 1997, year of the handover, where I had been also together with Stefan, and decided then to study Mandarin in Beijing, and lived then for 10 years in China, most time as a correspondent for German Stern magazine. And that's my background, and that brings me back to your question about Xi Jinping as the most powerful man of the world. I mean, when Stefan and I started to talk about it, we had been surprised that there was no comprehensive biography yet of him. I mean, there are, of course, some books about China which have Xi Jinping in the title, but not like telling his complete life story. And we decided we have to do this. And what we did was no magic. I mean, everybody who speaks Chinese like myself can go look into the Chinese archives, what we did, because there had been a lot of things published about him, especially also in the time before he was the general secretary of the Communist Party and the president, mainly because he's the husband of Peng Liyuan, who is a very famous singer in China. It's like Beyoncé in the United States. So, and because of this celebrity status, so to say, VIP status, he was a local, provincial cadre of the Communist Party, official of the Communist Party, but his wife was famous. And so a lot of local media made interviews about him. And that was a very nice source to find a lot of things about his life story.
Maybe there's one thing quite interesting to add about the way we started to work on this book. About 10 years ago, I was in Shanghai. No, I was in Singapore, and I met a German professor, and he explained me how Confucianism is getting really important in Singapore and in China mainly. And so when I came back, I talked to Adrian, and we decided to make a book with the title "With Confucius to World Power." And because we could see that because the ideas of Confucius came back into politics and into the human thinking in China, we could see that there was something really changing. And I think that was the first real change we covered with the book. And now you can see that another turn is going on in China, and that really has to do with the essence of the book and of the person who is on the way to become the leader of the imperium China for the next, I don't know, century.
I think that's
prize.
Yeah, we see, and we'll see at the, as I think that's cemented at the upcoming Congress in the coming days. But you raised the point how you came from Confucianism, your examination of that, and you talk about how I think it's interesting in your book. I see the three ways that Xi has pulled threads of culture and power together. One, you mentioned Confucianism and control of Chinese history. Two, the vanguard of Xi Jinping thought, interestingly, as you mentioned, though, is not little red books, but he goes to Davos and says that he is inheriting the stability of the order. That's a very different approach. But then the third is still that Marxist-Leninist core of thought that they still have. How do you see those three? I described it briefly, but describe how he's brought those three together, please.
Actually, I think this is the most important point. When I'm rather old and I grew up in a divided country like Germany, and we were discussing about communism all the time, about the Cold War and everything, and we were convinced that, at least most of us, were convinced that communism and socialism do not function. When you do not have a free enterprises and market business and all these things, it just can't work. So you looked across the wall and you saw East Germany, and you saw that the wealth was rather low. The whole system, the economic system, did not work, and there were good reasons why the Communist Party in East Germany and in the Soviet Union didn't want to allow the free market, free enterprise system, because capitalism, that's what we thought, and that's probably what they thought would be the end of socialism, because you cannot have a socialist regime and at the same time a capitalist market system. And this is exactly what developed in China during the last 20 years when they opened it up. And I think what we thought, that a communist system cannot exist with a market economy. This is the same idea and the same fear. For us, it was the hope. And I think for Xi Jinping, it's the fear that the whole system would collapse if it would develop into a free society. And that's why I think right now he goes back to the structures and the authoritarian structures of a socialist communist system. Closing the borders again, not completely because that's not possible, but using, let's say, the ideas of lockdown during the pandemic to get in control of the whole system again, because I think he's afraid if that country would be open as it was before and would be more open, and people travel to different countries, young students study somewhere else, they would bring not only their knowledge of economy and technique with them, but the idea and the virus of freedom as well. So in fact, fighting the virus, the coronavirus, he's fighting the virus of freedom.
That's exactly right. And so the one thing is the repression, but the other thing is the ideology. And that's exactly what you mentioned before. I mean, I start this answer with a small episode which just came into my head, an interview I made in like 2007. It must have been with some young people in China. I was living in that time in China, I was a correspondent there. And I asked these young people, we were sitting together drinking some beer, and I asked them, what do you connect with the word communism? And first there was silence, nobody knew what they should say. And then one young girl, she said, nobody believes anymore in communism. This is exactly the point where Xi Jinping started, and he knows this, and he tries to change this by, on the one hand, okay, like also extend again, like in old times, this Marxist-Leninist studies, but also, as you mentioned before, by extending it to the whole Chinese history. which is interesting because it's quite the opposite of what Mao Zedong was doing. Mao Zedong said the old China was bad, a bad feudalistic country, Confucius, very bad. We have to get rid of all these old ideas. I mean, this was the idea of the Cultural Revolution, or one of the ideas of the Cultural Revolution.
Without the communist, without the Communist Party,
culture.
there is no new China. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And but now Xi Jinping makes something very interesting. He puts himself into the tradition as well of Confucius and as well of Mao Zedong, which is like a kind of opposite. And he even puts himself into the tradition of the Chinese emperors. So Mao Zedong said they are very bad. He says old China was great. It was the most developed country in the world. And we continue these great things the old Chinese emperors did.
Yeah, I think that that's interesting too, because it brings up that topic of history. And as you all put together this biography of Xi Jinping, and you mentioned the idea of that, how do you confront these crises, a virus of COVID and the virus of freedom at the same time? How did you, when you biographied Xi, see key moments in history that may have affected his thinking, be it his time studying in the Soviet Union, his time as a party official when there were certain crises like the Tiananmen Square, other moments in Chinese history, what he saw also of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and Russia? How did you see history and these moments affecting Xi Jinping, much as we discussed opening this, how history affected our perspectives?
Actually, I think this is the general idea we had when we wrote the book. We didn't want to write a book about China. You don't know where you start and you don't know where you end. And the interesting thing always, that's what I learned when I was working for Spiegel and doing a lot of films. The best to tell the story of a country is to tell it along the lifeline of a person. And the best to tell the lifeline of a person is to have this person in the background of what he makes, what he works, where he goes to demonstrations or does not go, and what kind of political position he has. So we thought it would be very interesting to try to go into the details of the history of this man, how his life has changed and how his government has changed, how the party has changed, how the economic situation has changed, the relationship to other countries, and you can see that there's one interesting thing we are quite often discussing when we have talking with people who read the book. How and why is a person whose father was in the very important league of the political leaders of China, and then he was in prison and he had conflicts with the party at that time with Mao, and he himself, she was in prison as well during the Cultural Revolution. Why did he not go to the United States and try to be a businessman? He probably is a very smart, intelligent guy. But I think in his family, the general idea of communism was very strong, and the general idea of nationalism was very strong, of the history and the tradition of China. And so I think that was so deeply in his heart, in his mind, that he decided to stay there and to try to get to the top. And actually, he was not only climbing up the ladder to this PowerPoint where he now is, because he is so smart, but because of his father and because of all the connections. Even in that system, it's not only a personal career. It's a lot of people working together to come to the real power and taking them with him to get to power. And so I think it's always not only one person, but it's a whole group of people climbing up the ladder to power.
and especially in China, where the family is so important. And so this Xi Jinping, the father of Xi Jinping, this had been the generation of the founders of the revolution, so to say, the fathers and mothers also of the revolution. I mean, both his parents, his father and mother, were fighting with a weapon in their hand for the revolution, took part at the Long March, which is like the founding story of the People's Republic of China. 120,000 communists going to the countryside to attack the cities from there. And from these 120,000 people, only 8,000 survived, the parents of Xi Jinping among them. So this is like a very deep root, and they're also very deep believers of communism. It's like in the United States, you have a lot of very Christian people, and in our book we write like communism is like a religion for people who don't believe in God, but also a system.
And you know, looking back into the Long March is like going back for Russians into the time of the revolution, and it's actually more or less very similar to the beginning of the American independence, of the fight against the British and the Constitution and all this. So this is one story which I think is in a certain way possible to compare it. And then there is another very important point. That's the collapse of socialism in Russia. And with the collapse of socialism in Russia, the Soviet Union fall apart. It lost their power in Europe, and it itself lost a lot of countries that had been members of the Soviet Union. And I think this is the moment where not only Putin thinks this is his Versailles, like in German, the Versailles Treaty. And the worst thing that ever happened in Russia was the end of the Soviet Union. And the fear that this would be the end of China as well when the system collapses is driving him. So that's why he does everything to stay in power and to keep the party in power, and to start campaigns against people who want to change something in the system. That's then the big fight against corruption. Because
no, I
you
think
can decide yourself who is corrupt and who is not.
Yes, that's the difference in the systems. But I think for our American audience, it is worth noting, as you note, that family history is comparable when Americans say that they're descended from pilgrims from the Mayflower, or that they are a daughter of the American Revolution. It's a very similar level of lineage in a way. But in a way too, there is that history and lineage, as you point out, of I'll use for lack of a better term from pop culture, the Game of Thrones within the Communist Party. And perhaps tell us a little bit more about how you mentioned there with the anti-corruption, you kind of previewed it. How has he used those tools? And, in China, absent due process, he's the judge and sentencer as well in many cases. How has he used that to consolidate his power amongst the party?
Adrian.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you said, he started his time in power with this so-called anti-corruption campaign, which actually has two sides. On the one hand, yes, corruption is a big problem in China, and Xi Jinping knows that this is a danger for the power of the Communist Party, because this party began as the party of the common people, of the workers, of the peasants, and so on. So if it's a party of the rich people and of the corrupt people, it has no credibility anymore. So he really wants to fight corruption to keep the party in power. But on the other hand, this anti-corruption campaign became a very good tool for him, like to eliminate all rivals, and not only rivals, but also any potential rival, because everybody is afraid. And like in Western countries, you can find that tax problem is every rich person. Like in China, with every official, you can find a corruption problem if you look for it, and if you don't find it, you make it up. So every official in China knows that if they speak up against Xi Jinping, they can go for corruption into prison for 10 years, for 20 years, or even sentenced to death. And this also sends a signal for the people who are even not in prison, because in China there's a saying, kill the chicken to frighten the monkey. So even if you're yourself not in prison, but you know who is in prison, so you prefer to keep quiet.
And that's actually the weak point in the whole system. If you have a communist system that is in the power of politics, of the schools and the whole society, and even in power of economy, then you have one system with a structure of power from top to bottom. When you have a capitalist system inside a socialist country, and you have a communist party on top, you have a big problem, because you have two big powers at the same time. And the power of the business class, of the business people, is getting bigger and bigger the more money they have, and the more people they pay for doing the work, and how much money they do with export, and a lot of different things. So if you have a situation like that, the danger for the party is very big, that the people who really have the money buy the politics. So the main thing he has to do to stay in power and to keep the party in power is to look that the money of the economic part of the society is not starting to rule the party system.
Mhm.
I just have to stop.
I think that's
Ich habe
Jack.
gerade ein Zeitinterview. Ich melde mich nachher, ja? So sorry.
I thought that might have been Jack Ma calling to agree with everything you just said. But maybe he can't watch through the firewall. But that's a kind of the main example of taking prominent business leaders and making an example of them, as you point out, the proverbial chicken, as it were. That said, though, how is this? We see the perception of doing business with China changing here in the US. It's obviously taking more significant turns with the announcements on export restrictions growing further here in our country. But how is it also changing in Europe? I know we've seen reports that there's a very big difference in the view between big business as opposed to the middle core companies that have long been export leaders. How is this changing? As for every action there is a reaction, and as Xi wants to reorient the economy away from the existing model, how is that affecting the perceptions in Europe?
We don't really know yet, but it's rather clear. If you see a country like Germany, who has only people and experience and education whatsoever. We do not have a lot of oil. We do not have a lot of gas. We could have more, but they don't want it. So the only way to really get a wealthy country is to construct things and to sell them, and to buy rather cheap gas and oil as possible. So that means if you have a lot of contacts to other countries, you can make a fortune. The German car industry sells, I think, 40% of all the cars, for instance, to China. On the other hand, we had 50% or even more than 50% of our natural gas from Russia. So we have to have connections to other countries. And if we have only connections to countries that have, let's say, a liberal democracy, the world is getting rather small for us. So the problem is you have to have connections to other countries. At the same time, you see that, for instance, the Chinese do not only buy the cars, but they study the cars very well and try to imitate things like Japan did before, and everybody does that. We did it as well. So that means that in a certain way, you always have to be a little bit faster and a little bit smarter, and at the same time, you get dependent on the market. So if you have a position of, let's say, pure morality, you wouldn't buy your gas from the Russians, and you wouldn't buy oil from some of the other countries, and you wouldn't sell your cars to countries where they don't have a democracy, then you're staying poor all the time. So you're always in a complicated situation because of the world market. Is not only out of countries that obey all our democratic orders we agree with, and sometimes we don't even agree to ourselves. So I think when the situation is changing, the situation, if you have war, it's closed down first, and maybe it takes some time until it comes into movement again. But I think it's not that easy to say we're going to divide the world again, like the times of the Cold War, and into the West and the East. And you have to see, and we see, that the East is getting more and more important, and more wealthy and powerful in this situation. And this is what we tried to explain and to show.
And what kind of new thing is that there is now also in Germany, also in Europe, some discussion about this, and some awareness about the problem. I remember some years ago, this was even not a topic. I mean, it was absolutely clear that we buy our gas from Russia, and it was absolutely clear that China, with 1.4 billion people, is the perfect market for the German industry, for Volkswagen, for Siemens, and so on and so on. I remember like events of Volkswagen in China, where the videos Volkswagen made had been like propaganda videos of the Communist Party, where the leaders of Volkswagen were standing together with the leaders of the Communist Party. Now, of course, after the Russian attack on the Ukraine and the dependence we see now from the Russian gas, there is some discussion about it, and some people say, we are even more dependent from China. But on the other hand, it's not a coincidence that the first G7 leader who is going to meet Xi Jinping after the party congress will be our Chancellor Olaf Scholz, because he, as a representative of the leading party in our governing coalition, as a social democrat, he very much sees this as important for German industry, that we, in spite of all ideological differences, have a good business relations to China, a little different from his coalition partners, the Free Democrats, and especially the Green Party, who tend to see the things more from a kind of moralistic point of view. But as for Olaf Scholz, who is leading the government, he, despite all problems, his tendency will be to continue the good relation to China.
Adrian, you said in your experience, you pointed out that you could look across at East Germany and saw that it didn't work. The questions are we seeing, is China going to continue to work, is I guess one economic question. But also, how does it change where, as you raise that moralistic point, we have more of it's working but Hong Kong, it's working but the Uyghurs. How does that affect the discussion, you think?
It does affect it. There is no doubt about it. When you look back into Germany before the fall of the wall, all the politicians were talking about reunification one day, Christmas, reunification. Nobody really believed it, or only a few people believed that this would be actually possible, that the Russians would give up the power over such a big part of Germany and then such a big part of Europe. Nevertheless, this was the way it came, and I think it will not be possible, and it will not be the same as it was before the fall of the wall. There won't be two parts of the world who actually have only one connection, which is a possible nuclear war. And I think I have a little bit the feeling, maybe this feeling is a little bit connection with hope. You can see that in the beginning, when the Russians marched into the Ukraine, it seemed like that China was completely on the side of the Russians. Now you hear some critical voices or words even from Xi Jinping. Maybe because he is always talking of taking over Taiwan, and in the former times was like Germany reunification. Now he says it has to be during not only his lifetime, but during his time when he is on as the leader of China. But maybe because of the sanctions and all the economic developments after the beginning of the Ukraine war, maybe he understands or has an idea that a military operation will cause an economic war before. And the only thing that keeps him in power is when the people in China, the majority in China, has wealth and cars and eating and be able to travel to other countries. He is risking his power when the wealth system in China is collapsing. So maybe he will be a little bit cautious of creating a military and at the same time an economic war. Maybe this is the chance we have. Hopefully.
This is right. And this brings me back to the first part of your question, because of course it could be the other way around. I mean, we see this tendency with Xi Jinping that he is abandoning that pragmatism that Deng Xiaoping and the other leaders before Xi Jinping had, that he puts now politics first and ideology first before economy. I mean, we see this with, for example, with the zero COVID politics in China, which is absolutely harmful for the economy, but because Xi Jinping made it as a part of his ideology, so they are doing it in a very extreme way, these harsh lockdowns in cities with millions and millions of people. But this exactly brings me to your point. If Xi Jinping will do this too extreme, the most dangerous person for Xi Jinping will be Xi Jinping himself, because Xi Jinping is so strong now, as we say, the strongest person in the world, because of this economic power which China got, not thanks to Xi Jinping, but thanks to the reform and opening up in the decades before Xi Jinping. So if Xi Jinping, like by, for example, attacking Taiwan, or by controlling too much the business community, like Jack Ma, as you mentioned, if he harms the economic progress of China, this will be dangerous for himself.
Mm-hmm. We talk about harming the economic future, and you mentioned too that hope that perhaps what was seen in the response to Ukraine is a warning about what would happen in an invasion of Taiwan. How, I'm curious from the European perspective, how have concerns about Taiwan changed post-Ukraine? I know it's very different being on the other side of the world compared to right on the continent, but has that changed how Europe thinks about the risk or a response to another act of war like that?
Actually, I think that Taiwan is a little bit further away. And right now, we look at the war in the Ukraine, we look at Russia, we look at the escalation of the war in the Ukraine. We see what happens when you rely on Russian gas and suddenly you don't get the gas. First you say we don't want it, and then you see that they don't send it anymore. And then you do not want to buy Russian oil at the same time, and you, even in Europe, you cut it down and you say we are not going to take Russian oil again. Then we buy, the price goes up and we buy the same oil from India, who bought it from Russia before. So I think right now the situation for the people in Germany, mainly in Germany, but all over Europe, is more concentrated on the Ukraine conflict. And at the same time, we see one thing, and it's not good, and not good for America as well, when China and Russia are getting too close together, because they have something that the Russians don't have, and the Russians have gas and oil and whatsoever, which China needs. So I think it would be very important to get the conflict as soon as possible a little bit down, not to divide the world into two parts, the West on one side, and then the Russians and the Chinese together. And actually you could see that the West has not so much support on other countries, from other countries as well. If you look at India or South Africa or Brazil or whatsoever. So I think it's better to try to calm down the whole thing.
That's sort of, it's a good point to, I think we're all I would use the English proverb, a fork in the road when it comes to some of these decisions. And one I want to say is we're in the last quarter hour here of this chat. If folks do want to put stuff in through the online Q&A, I will try and work that into the conversation. So just a little note to our audience, if they do have questions, to please submit them. But in that spirit of, as I said, a fork on the road, your book ends right at the invasion of Ukraine and Russia and China, as you say, moving closer, the beyond an alliance, a true friendship type statement. Do you think Xi Jinping has, though, you discussed it, is it fair to say he has a bit of buyer's remorse given Russia's performance in Ukraine?
Adrian?
I mean, it's a complex question, because first one has to say Xi Jinping and Putin are two persons who have a very similar mindset. They are both afraid of too much democracy, too much freedom, too much of the people talking. They both want a strict state, and they both see themselves as persons of history, see themselves as representatives of countries who have been harmed by the Western world, by colonialism, or I mean, in the case of China, by colonialism, that China as this big empire, culturally and economically a leading country in the world for thousands of years, had become a poor country after the colonial powers invaded them. And for Putin, much more recent, of course, the fall down of the Soviet Union, and that Russia is not the same kind of empire as it had been as the Soviet Union had been and as Russia historically had been. Though this unites both people. And as you hinted, not by coincidence, I mean, Putin started this war against the Ukraine after Putin and Xi Jinping met in Beijing in February at the opening of the Olympic Games and released a joint declaration where they declared their joint worldview that the world order has to be changed, and the West and especially United States should not have the influence in the world they had in the last decades. This said, of course, as Stefan already explained, I mean, there is a difference between Putin and Xi Jinping in the sense that Xi Jinping, so to say, is more rational. I mean, Putin is more like the bad boy who tries some extreme things, while Xi Jinping has a long-term plan. He is always speaking about the 2 centenaries. The first one, 2021, 100 years of Communist Party of China, until which the China wanted to achieve like a modest prosperity for all Chinese people, a goal which somehow had been widely achieved. I mean, there had more than 800 million people in China who had been lifted out of poverty. And the next goal, 2049, 100 years of the People's Republic of China, when China wants to be the leading country in the world. What I want to say, Xi Jinping has more the long-term plan, while Putin more tries the short-term things.
And actually, there's another difference. The success of China is because there are a lot of people and intelligent people and working people. And in the beginning, it started with a working bench of the world. So the success, the development of China is made by the people themselves. Russia was not able to get an economy that really works in itself and is really successful. They are still living from their export of gas and their export of oil and coal and everything. That's the main difference. One is the population, and the other one is the stuff that's in the earth. Maybe it's not quite fair to a lot of working people in Russia, but I think this is really the main difference. But there is one thing very similar, and I don't think this is so much different from politicians in other countries, even in democracies as well, that somebody who is in power thinks that he has to stay in power as long as he lives, because there's no one else who could keep the power up and the power structure up and the country together. And when we look back into the history of the United States, comparing it, the revolution in the United States and the French Revolution and the revolution in Russia, it's where they look back. But the system in Russia collapsed. It collapsed when the Soviet Union fell apart. And I think one of the biggest, the greatest strengths of a Western democracy, and there America is a very good example, is you have a way to change the government without a revolution, without a war, without an uprising of the population. So even in America, even you have a law, it's in the Constitution, but only most of the people do not know it, only after the Second World War, because before that it was nobody really did it, because George Washington didn't run for a third term. But to make a restriction that a president can only be president for 2 terms. And that's what the Russians copied after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian president was only allowed to have 2 terms in power. And that is what they still have in China. Putin changed it so he can stay. If they don't have a coup d'etat, he will probably stay to be the president till he dies. And Xi is trying, and he will probably be able to change it now. And I think for every system, it's very dangerous that the people who are on top try and have the possibility to stay there till the end of their time. Because most of the time, that's even in democracies, that when they are too long in power, for the third or fourth term, the main goal they have is to stay in power. And in a lot of countries, and maybe this is one of the reasons why Putin went into the Ukraine with his military forces, is like every dictatorship does it, when they want to stay in power, they start a war.
Which could be concerning if Xi Jinping feels the need to stay in power at some point. But is that, and that is a question that one of our audience members puts forward, is that when Xi is challenging the US sphere of influence, perhaps short of war in many ways, militarizing islands, expanding the Navy, what does he see as the advantage of that? Is it expanding China's security merely? Is it nationalist aims? Is it achieving long-term goals?
Demonstrating power. And I think when he is demonstrating power, it is not very smart from the other side helping him by escalating the whole thing. So I think it's very important to look that a conflict is not going to escalate, because you know, an important politician makes a demonstration by visiting Taiwan, then he makes a demonstration by sending his planes, and so and as you can see in the Ukraine war now, it's the danger that a conflict is escalating is very, very big. And sometimes I have the feeling that the situation, at least in Europe, is comparable to the beginning of the First World War, when, you know, everybody does a little step, and in the end they don't realize that they end up in an inferno. And this is very dangerous. So I think every side has to see that the conflict is not escalating, because this war, when it's getting really big, nobody can win.
And how do you know, I think important to that mindset is, as we know from the historical example you cite of World War I, the psychology of specific leaders comes into question. What do you think of Xi's temperament and capability in a crisis? We've seen perhaps a glimpse of it with the COVID response, but what about something more acute like a Taiwan crisis? Or, you know, I hesitate to imagine, people often forget because it was overshadowed by 9/11, the collision of the US plane that was forced down in Hainan in 2001. What would it be like if something external or internal happened today, and how do you think Xi would respond?
When I look, when I look on his lockdown politics, zero COVID, I'm getting afraid of how he reacts when it's getting really, really important. I think he has obviously a tendency to get very strict with his solutions and decisions when he is getting into a conflict.
That's right. I mean, from all what we describe in our book about his life story, you can see that he's very cold-blooded. That's also the word how some people who met him several times describe him. He's very decisive. And there is even another problem, independent from the psychological structure, so to say, of Xi Jinping. It's the absolute power he has now. It's the cult of personality which is around him, and this brings a climate when he will be not open anymore for critical voices, or critical voices will be afraid to talk to him, to talk out to him if they see a problem. And this is a very dangerous situation.
And if you have a power structure where you can stay in power as long as you live, you surround yourself only with people who say yes to you. There are no critical people around with these people to whom they talk, and that makes it very, very dangerous. I hope he's not only cold-hearted, but he's cool. But you cannot see that he's really cool.
No,
Being cool
no,
means, you know, let it go. We can't change everything. If somebody thinks he's almighty, that's very dangerous.
Yeah, to use the engineering comparison, you want a little flex in your structure, otherwise it's brittle.
Yeah.
And
Right.
the Chinese system, the more rigid it becomes, maybe that's another lesson from the broader arc of Chinese history, though, from if Xi truly wants to learn from the emperors, the more centralized and inefficient a system becomes, the more vulnerable it comes from both without and within.
Definitely.
Definitely. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I do want to thank you all. I do want to note, actually, as we close this conversation, my colleague, I just sent you all in the discussion chat. There are protesters in Beijing today ahead of the party Congress, putting banners up saying no to the dictator, no to COVID, yes to food. Something you don't see in Beijing, I will say, perhaps further out in the country and quietly, but this is something that we'll keep an eye on. But avoid, I'd say, Western wishful thinking, though. Xi Jinping is very firmly in power. But I look forward to talking to you more in the future, though. I think, you know, as we said, many of these things are at the fork in the road. And I thank you for sharing this wonderful book. It was a great read, very informative. I highly recommend it. Thank you to you both.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for tuning in, and take care. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Stay well. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.